you say, I'm the director of a new journalism think tank at the London School of Economics. Until last year, I was a programme editor at Channel 4 News. Polis, very quickly, does a whole series of kind of lectures and seminars and other activity and research and so on. We're very much about trying to get journalists involved. Not next week, on June the 27th, for example, we've got a report we've published based on a conference we did about the role of the media in Africa. So if anybody's interested in that, or if you're interested at all in the fellowship schemes and so on that we run, please get in touch. Tonight's discussion is sort of predicated partly on the book, which is all about the last 100 years of the NUJ, and signed copies are available at the back of the room. But in a sense, we want to look at the present and the future. In my history about the NUJ, well, 20 years ago when I started as a journalist in South London, I set up worked for a free sheet and set up the first chapel there, and I managed to get NCTJ training agreed. Since then I've worked at the BBC and ITN, where we also saw industrial action. Now I work in a university at the LSE, and one of the sort of ironies of that is that I now find myself in this curious situation where the two unions most relevant to my work are both interested in policies that some would say restrict freedom of expression. And that latest spat about the idea of a possible Israel boycott can also be set in the context of the whole technological changes that our business is going through, and the sort of ethics and the practice about audience participation in journalism. And we'd like to try and talk about whether journalism, how journalism has codes of conduct and the kind of ethics and practices we adopt. But most importantly, is there a role for the NUJ? Is there a role for a trade union in that kind of citizen journalism, that more participatory journalism that I think we're all going to find ourselves taking part in the future? So the question is, if you like, is the NUJ fit for purpose? And is journalism fit for purpose? And can the NUJ cope with the next 10 years, if not the next 100? Delighted to be joined tonight by three very different journalists. Tony Benn, you're all very familiar with, former Labour Cabinet Minister. Lifetime, I think, NUJ member. And somebody who's probably written as much as any journalist alive today, both about politics and, of course, his own diaries. And also, in a sense, was a sort of early pioneering TV producer in that he sort of invented, or at least professionalised, the whole idea of party political broadcasts. Like Mr. Benn, Jeremy Dear, president of the NUJ, was something of a bright young thing of the left. He left Cardiff University. He'd done postgraduate journalism training, wasn't it? To be father of the chapel at the Essex Chronicle, aged 22. He took him out on strike. The strike failed, and 8 years later, he was president of the NUJ.
Easy as that.
There's a lesson for us all. David Aaronovitch, to my left, also a man steeped in the history of the left. David and I have got two things in common, at least. One of them was that we both went to, as kids, we both went to something called Forest School Camp, which was a kind of left-wing version of the Scouts. The other thing we had in common was we both worked at the BBC under John Birt, which was also a left-wing version of the Scouts, really. David, of course, is now a columnist at the Times, and he's so important that he even has a website devoted to criticising his every move. Although I think you're sort of losing your touch, David, because Aaronovitch Watch actually agreed with your last posting on the Zionist lobby, so you should be worried. Obviously, tonight we're going to have a sort of chat around the issues first with the panel and then throw it out to you. I want to sort of start with the Israeli lobby idea, if only so that we can perhaps then move on to it. And it's very much not in the context of whether perhaps a lobby itself is a good thing or a bad thing, but whether a journalist trade union should be getting involved in not just politics, but that kind of politics which can be seen to impinge on, one can argue, free expression. David, do you think it compromises journalists at all to be seen to be adopting something like that?
Right, we're not discussing the merits of this particular boycott. One of the things that unions have to be very careful about, because they tend to be, in their policy deliberation, activist-based, is that the activists don't pull clear of where the members are, and don't, in their zeal to have a particular view predominate, don't actually do something which discredits the union in the eyes of its own membership, let alone the rest of the world. It's always a continual problem. It's more of a problem in the NUJ than it is elsewhere because of the way the leadership itself behaves and the way in which the leadership itself, in my opinion, postures on political issues. And so, I mean, I know, for instance, on the boycott that Jeremy is against it. I mean, he's not said so, but he's against it. I believe you are, Jeremy. At least you haven't said you're in favour of it, which is an interesting thing when it's your own union has passed the resolution. And I've been, in my own modest way, a leader of a union as well. I was president of the National Union of Students, and this sort of stuff was always on the cusp of happening. And so on, and you sometimes had to be extremely careful. Every now and again, a resolution was passed that you didn't agree with and you thought was damaging, and you had to decide how to deal with it. And I think you've dealt with it in a very interesting way, which is not to defend it and not to attack it. And I think, but if you were to ask me whether or not trades unions or other democratic bodies should have the right to discuss or to pass resolutions on matters which are not strictly trade or professional, then my answer would be yes, but they're going to have to be very careful about how they do it. And maybe occasionally, well, not just occasionally, the NUJ has not been sufficiently clear. I'll give you an example. At the Independent where I was, the mother of the chapel was continuously signing up to statements about the world of politics, including those attacking certain types of journalism, but always used to say, mother of the Independent NUJ chapel in a personal capacity. I have never understood what that notion of using your title in a union and then saying in a personal capacity was, if you weren't trying to suggest that your membership or the office that you held in the union gave you a specific position. It's a contradiction. And actually, at one stage, when the Independent wanted to extend the range of its NUJ membership, I had actually been an ACTS member through television and so on. The fact that she'd done this actually stopped me joining the NUJ at that point. I just thought, I just can't be asked with this, so I didn't.
But do you think it's, do you differentiate between journalists and any trade union?
No, not particularly, no. I don't see why it's in principle different. No, I don't. I mean, it's the business of, I mean, frankly, the business of the NUJ contains members from such diverse parts of what we call journalism. To be absolutely honest, there are people working in the trade of journalism today who I don't think of as being in the same trade as me. I mean, maybe it's incredibly snobby and maybe they'll turn up later, but somebody who goes around trying to dig up the dirt on somebody else's private life for a living is not, I believe, in the same trade as I am, by and large. They're in the comics and scandal trade, and I like to think, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but that's not quite the business I'm in.
Tony, do you think that, I mean, obviously you believe that trade unions should adopt political postures. Does it make you...
What is a posture?
Position then. But do you feel that you would feel just as comfortable if a non-union journalist stood up and declared that they were adopting certain policies like that, and then going into somewhere and reporting upon it?
But I mean, of course, I'm a human being. Everything I do is in a personal capacity. The Prime Minister went to war in a personal capacity. He didn't ask anybody else. I mean, this idea, if you're a journalist, you've got some special position. After all, the Bar Council takes a view about behaviour of barristers, about starting a barrister. The General Medical Council takes a view. What is it about journalism makes us so careful we mustn't say anything that accepts anybody else? I mean, debate is about debate. And you could disagree with what's said, but I can't see any validity in that argument at all. I'm a member of the National Union of Journalists because I worked in the BBC. At that time they didn't recognise the NUJ. They was the BBC Staff Association, which I wouldn't join, and I joined the NUJ and the BBC wouldn't recognise it, and then later, when I'd left, they did. But this idea that journalists are so special, quite different from other people, is, I think, very arrogant. I mean, the fact he's a journalist, I'm a journalist, doesn't alter the fact that we're individuals with our own opinion and should be free to express them. And then the elective process means you can get rid of the people you don't like. I mean, if you're an MP, it's a funny position. The only job I know is one employee and 60,000 employers. And when I was in my constituency, everybody in there employed me, the bus driver, the street sweeper, the home help, the policeman, the district nurse. I was free to say what I wanted to, which I did, and they were free to get rid of me, so I had to listen to them. And that is the democratic responsibility. It doesn't mean people agree with me, or that I ever pretended everything I said represented everybody in my constituency. And as the boycott, just a matter of opinion. There are people who think, and I share the views, you've got to do something to help the Palestinians who can't even get to their universities without going through a checkpoint. And so that's why I take that view. And I must warn you, I did put down the first motion in the House of Commons in 1960 for a boycott of South Africa. And it was in a personal capacity. I didn't ask anybody else. I think a few people shared that view. So all I'd like to say, don't make journalists so special they can't be involved in anything other than their journalism. And mind you, the NUJ is very important because the technical change, the protection of pay and conditions, I mean, look at Wapping and everything that's happened since. The unit's absolutely critical from that, and that is its professional role.
Jeremy, do you want to clear up, first of all, whether you agree with it or not, on the actual policy itself? And do you want to then talk about whether, I mean, there's the technical issue about whether it'll happen and what effect it might have. And there's also this idea that, of course, journalists can have their own opinion, but if that's what's seen to be the priority or a concern, then inevitably it's going to somehow detract from other policy areas that you might be more concerned about.
I mean, it's a kind of no-win situation, isn't it? Because you have one person who says you can't have personal opinions because you represent the National Union of Journalists, and then if I say what my personal opinion is, then someone's going to pick one side or the other and say, well, I'm not doing my job. My job is elected to carry out the policy democratically decided by the union's policy-making bodies. The supreme policy-making body there is the union's annual conference. Do I agree with every motion they pass? No, I don't. But my job is to carry them out and to implement them. And therefore, my individual opinion. The reason people say I'm against it is because I was sent an email the following day saying, did you vote for it? And I said, no. The reason I didn't vote for it is because I don't have a vote. Not because I'm for or against it. The executive didn't have a position either for or against it. It is for the members of the union to use the democratic processes of the union to decide the union's policy, and then for the union to implement that policy. That means sometimes I'm in meetings saying things that I don't agree with, but that's my job. And if I didn't do that, and Rory, who's one of the people who's been very engaged in trying to overturn the boycott, and I think it's a good thing that there is a democratic debate in the NUJ about it, says, well, like Sally Hunt in the UCU, the other union has a boycott, then I should agree to have a ballot of all the members. Well, her rule book allows for that to happen. Our rule book doesn't. Our rule book is democratically decided by the members. Therefore, again, my job is to uphold the democracy. Whether I think there are better ways of the democracy to happen is kind of neither here nor there. Now, part of my job is to try and improve the union's democracy, and I actually think the annual delegate meeting is not as democratic as it could be. There's not enough participation, there's not enough branches active, not enough branches send their full delegation. We have 207 motions in 3 days. The Musicians' Union have 9 motions in 3 days. That means they have a much more in-depth debate, but maybe not across a broad enough range of subjects. So, I mean, I'm incredibly frustrated by this motion. That's true, because actually the union has an awful lot of issues to deal with on pay, on convergence, on integration, on job losses, on what is happening in the industry, and we're spending an awful lot of time and activity on this one out of 207 motions. That's my frustration with it.
But that is sort of an admission of call it not necessarily a failure of leadership, but certainly there's something strange about the culture of the union if that's what it feels it wants to be obsessed by.
But it's not. It's one motion out of 207 that were dealt with at the conference. What happens, though, is that people who are opposed to it get engaged in a debate, and it's important then that the union
would result in this. You knew it would result in
I knew it would. In fact, that as it was being debated, I called our campaigns officer from the back of the hall and said, "Will you log on and look?" 4 minutes after the vote was passed, the first email came into my account. And it happened ever since, and that's a frustration for the union. But it happens on other issues, and it's happened over 100 years of our history that we've had issues like this democratically decided on that are probably, as Dave said, not the key issues in most journalists' mind at the time. But if you have 207 motions, amongst those there are going to be some that some people disagree with, and then the path is open to them in the union to use the union's democracy. We are one of, despite the fact there are deficiencies with our democracy, one of the most democratic unions that there is, and sometimes actually that causes us problems. But I'd far rather that than have a union that had no democracy in it.
No, I mean, because I don't know the details, and I don't know whether you were able to stand up at the conference and warn the delegates against passing this particular motion, or whether your executive was able to. I mean, certainly, going back a long, long way, if I'd seen this one coming at the National Union of Students, we'd have headed it off at the pass. I certainly would have been up on that platform saying this is going to be a bit of a bloody disaster for us if this passes, because frankly, you delegates out there ought to know that's not what they think back in the colleges. And you've got to think quite carefully before you do it. Now, if people did make that argument, then the delegates rather willfully decided to ignore it. But one of the things which is it is very difficult for a union to do, and I can see this with the UCU at the moment, is does everybody want to go back into these organisations and spend their time trying to overturn stupid decisions that people who are unrepresentative make? Is this what we want to do with our time, or would we rather do something else? Now, I think there's a big argument for doing a bit of that, etc., but a lot of people don't accept that. They're not going to want to do that, and therefore it is a big problem. I can quite accept what you're saying about changing the democratic basis of the union. But I have to say, Jeremy, I mean, one of the things I did this morning on the train as I came down was kind of log in and look at some of your own kind of utterances over the last few years. And I'm not surprised on the basis of those why your delegates would think that this was a kind of motion in line with the union's general kind of thing. I mean, you do an awful lot of stuff about socialist leadership and all this kind of stuff, which has nothing to do with what your members elected you for. But I would have thought you tipped the wink, in a sense, to people that that's the kind of leadership you were running and that's the kind of union you were running. I mean, there's one bit where you say, quite apart from a really wonderful interview I've got here that you gave with El Militante of Spain back in 2003, and it just seems arcane, you ought to kind of read it. You make it sound as if you think you're Lenin. And it just gives the wrong impression. I'm not saying, and I completely agree with Tony here, about people should have their opinions. We were having a discussion about whether or not journalists in certain places should be candidates for political parties. And I certainly think they should, and the BBC should allow that. I think actually part of the problem, and I think Tony would probably agree with this, is that too few journalists actually have experience of being in political organisations. But you really have to know when to stop and put that hat away, etc., and when to do the other thing. I think the NUJ does important work. When I read about a freelance who has their contract upheld by an employer that wanted not to uphold them because the NUJ has intervened, that is a very important thing to do. Somebody like me doesn't need that, but other people do. But I do think it's compromised by you wandering around with Hugo Chavez saying what an incredibly wonderful place Venezuela is, and then just forgetting when he closes down opposition TV stations.
Let's say just a lie.
Sorry? Do you what? Shut up.
No, that's not really
What is it? Let's take some points.
And you move on at some point, because I'm picking up that quite a few people here are very irritated.
What?
Is it possible?
How are you picking that up? How are you picking it up?
What about Jeremy's own personal views?
No, okay. No, does anybody want to make some points? No. I think there are quite a few people who do actually want to talk about this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly take some questions from the floor on this one, because you're quite right, it's a sort of discrete issue, so we'll try and deal with this for the next 10 minutes, and then we're going to try and move on to some other things. So, do you want to make a point, you two, or no? Okay. Guy in the red, yeah?
I'd like to make a point, and it goes back to David's first point. Jeremy's not our leadership. I'm Donnacha Dillogam on the NEC. I'm declaring that to show my position, but I'm speaking in a personal capacity. And I think actually that's why most people declare who they are and then say personal capacity, because otherwise somebody will turn around and go, actually you're speaking for, sorry, Donnacha Dillogam, the new media representative on the NEC. I'm declaring that because I'm declaring my position. In fact, we're the leadership between ADMs, and ADM is the leadership. He's not. Whatever he says, and he might try and go off ranting about left-wing issues, we knew that when people elected him. He is a ranting lefty.
Thanks for all your support.
And in fact, he ran opposed the last time because people are happy with the job he does. And most of the membership clearly is happy with that. But he is not the leadership. We're the leadership, the NEC is, and ADM is the leadership when it meets. And that's the leadership.
Rory, did you want to make a point?
Yeah. I think what David said about the dangers...
Sorry, you're talking in a personal capacity now.
I should stress I'm not speaking on behalf of the BBC or anything but myself. And my interest in this has not been because I have strong views one way or the other on Israel. I do have very strong views on my reputation and particularly BBC members' reputations as impartial journalists. And at the meeting we held, which was the best attended branch meeting anybody ever remembered, one member who works in the Middle East showed us two cards. You know, the BBC card said, I'm proud to carry this. This, in my view, says I'm an impartial journalist. And on the other side, I've got my NUJ card, and this now says I'm a biased journalist. That's the message that we're sending out. And that was a very widely held view from a large part of the membership, which is very, very passive most of the time. I've been in the union 24, 25 years. The younger people coming into the BBC and not joining the union, it's the old farts are in the union. The young people say, why would we join a union that makes daft decisions like this? And that is the danger, that the activists have run away with the union.
Can I just say something? You see, in order to sit in Parliament, I had to tell 14 lies under oath. In order to sit in Parliament, you have to swear by Almighty God or affirm that you will bear faithful and true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors according to law. I have no allegiance to the Queen. My allegiance to my conscience, to my colleagues, and to my constituents. And therefore I had to tell lies. And when I became a Privy Councillor, they took me to the Privy Council office and read an even worse oath saying I would report colleagues who were disloyal to the Queen and protect the Queen from foreign prelates, potentates and powers, which would include Europe. And at the end I said I haven't agreed. And they said we've administered the oath. I never knew till then, that an oath was an ejection. I've had an injection of a Privy. Now you see, this is a load of rubbish. We are people. We may be journalists, we may work for the BBC, we may be in the Labour Party, we may be... What's wrong with having a debate? The fact that he is the president of the NUJ and has a view on boycotting, that's just part of the debate. I find this incredible. I mean, particularly as if there's a debate within the Labour Party about policy, all the journalists leap on it and say split, 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 and try and destroy the debate by saying, and I don't know who you represent when you write in the papers. Do you represent yourself? You represent yourself? Well, who do you consult? Would you put in your thing a David Aaronovitch personal capacity? They might think it was the Observer.
It's a column. It is personal capacity.
I don't have to say it. I mean, I might well assume that it was the Observer.
Does anybody else want to say anything?
I don't know.
Am I able to defend myself?
No, let's take a few, then you can... yeah, and then you can... When you get a rich vein of them. This gentleman here.
Hi there. I understand Jeremy's concerns about split off from the NUJ, all the different things that presumably worries him. But there's a very serious issue here. I mean, Rory Kethledge-Jones made the comment about impartial journalism. We all know in Auschwitz we would not have wanted impartial journalism. We don't want people partial to Nazis on the one hand and Jews being exterminated on the other. But there's an even more serious issue here. It's about the craft of being a journalist. while David Aaronovitch was saying he would resign if no WMD was found in Iraq, my colleagues on the Today programme were trying to persuade the country that they were lying. There's a reason why I suspect that those journalists against the boycott do journalism in a particular way. Rory Catherine Jones, someone who I worked with, I think 10 or more years ago, is not going to connect Marks and Spencer with the war on terror. There's a context to this which shows that those journalists that are against the boycott are doing journalism in a way which is not informing their readers. There's a context to their opposition, which means that they're going to get things wrong. It's a much more serious issue. The way they analyse the world, for instance, I think you did say you'd resign if there was
Of course
no
I didn't.
WMD.
No.
But you were one of the war's cheerleaders. There's a reason perhaps why, because you don't understand the Middle East. You don't understand how it's so connected with what's going on here and all around the world. And in your analysis of the war on terror, you're going to fail your audience. It's very exceptional that the NUJ should be debating such a stringent issue, but I think these are exceptional times.
What is the link between that and the boycott? I don't understand.
If you don't realise why a boycott of Israeli goods is required
It's necessary.
now,
Then
how
you
it
can't do good
connects
journalism.
with the war on terror, with everything that's happening, then that's going to influence the kind of journalism you do, which is not fair journalism.
That's utterly bizarre.
Take one more. I'm coming back to you, Jeremy. Take one more, lady at the back, and then we'll let Jeremy come back in.
I'm a member of the NUJ and I also work for the BBC. What I decide at my ADM does not affect my capacity and my independence to be an objective journalist. I find it totally undemocratic feelings and undemocratic tendencies among those colleagues who cannot accept a decision which was taken democratically, and that is the only right decision. I'm proud of it. It was as important as it was to boycott South African goods. If that did not affect people's judgment, I cannot see why it is absolutely crucial now that it would. It is, if those people who feel that this decision would affect their judgment or their independence or objectivity, it is their problem. And it is a crucial decision, it is the right decision, and I'm very proud of it.
Okay, thanks. I'll stop there from the floor. And also, Jeremy, just to sort of add another question. In a sense, that kind of is sort of proof of the pudding, isn't it? I mean, whether it's a good thing or not to create debate, that you've there is a division there amongst journalists because of straying into that contentious area, that it per se, regardless of the merits of it, that it is creating more problems than it's solving.
Is it creating more problems than it's solving? I don't know. There's certainly a division. I mean, the number of emails that have come in to me runs at about 54-46. You would get the impression, if you read most of the media, there was only one opinion on it, but actually 54-46. And in branches, 7 branches or chapels have passed resolutions against the position the NUJ adopted. 8 have declined to do so, and yet again you would get the impression that there was only a campaign one way. The biggest problem for me in an industrial sense as a union organiser is actually that split doesn't do me any good when I go to the BBC, for example, and there are job cuts and pay disputes and pensions and so on. So I would rather there wasn't that split, but I would defend 100% the democratic right of the union to be able to make decisions on things it wants. As David has hinted at and others, it's then up to certain people, the leadership of the union and others, to point out what are the good and the bad points in that. But let me just explain or to some extent defend my own position, because I've been called a ranting lefty many times in my life, and I'm sure I'll be called, and I'm sure Tony spent a lot of his life being called a ranting lefty. I was when I was a student, I was when I was FOC at a company that was derecognised and we went on strike, and my employers called me a ranting lefty for daring to take industrial action against them, removing the human right to collective bargaining. And I certainly would describe myself as an industrial militant, someone who believes aggressively in the right of unions and the right of unions to collective bargaining. And that was made clear by 5 opponents when I stood for election as General Secretary, not President, General Secretary of the NUJ, and I won a convincing victory, and as Donica just said, last year I was re-elected unopposed, and in those 6 years we've had 6 years of growth of membership, 17,000 more journalists now covered by collective bargaining, 180 new industrial recognition agreements. They are the things the NUJ should be immensely proud of, and if you want to say I'm the leadership when it comes to a question on Israel, then you also need to praise the leadership at the same time for the way in which it has turned the NUJ round from a union that was bankrupt and marginalised to a union that is now a force again to be reckoned with in some parts of the media, but with a long way still to go.
Do you discipline people? Do you discipline anyone who disagrees with the policy of the union?
We're not allowed to. Margaret Thatcher removed that right from trade unions. Golf clubs have it, but trade unions don't.
Yeah, but you can't discipline. You don't discipline people who have a different opinion.
Of course not. Debate is great.
Well, that's what I was just trying to do. Yes,
Unless anybody else has got anything to on the boycott, I wanted to try and move it on to... Sorry, very quickly. Go on.
Yeah. Thanks. I joined the NUJ about 4 years ago, being in journalism for 32. I am also familiar with the academic boycott. Only today I received an email from St. Paul University in the States, where a distinguished professor was denied tenure by the president, not by colleagues in the university. The committee elected him, approved of his tenure. The students selected him. The president disapproved of his tenure because he received an email or an opposition from Harvard University law professor saying that this Norman Falkenstein published a piece about Holocaust and criticized the Harvard law professor about his work. So personally, when it comes to boycott, I do it in my own way. I am, of course, I have to select the things, and I have to judge and work hard in getting my articles objectively done.
Okay.
And I think that's the best way we'll do it.
Okay. So you can do a boycott in a personal capacity as well.
Yeah.
I want to move on to the new media, or rather the sort of, not just the new media, but the whole sort of future of journalism bit, because I don't know if you're aware, but the NUJ recently published a code of, is it code of conduct, Jeremy? Is that the right phrase?
Practice. You're talking about the citizen journalism.
Yeah. Which was actually called a code of practice for witness contributors. And I just wondered, this was described by, I've got the quote in here somewhere,
Emily Bell.
the lovely Emily Bell, who said this was a sort of code of practice whereby employers should make sure they try and pay people who contribute, they should make sure they verify and what the contributions were and so on. And Emily Bell said that, quote, wholesale adoption of the code would lead to no blogs with free comments on them run by established media organisations, no picture streams or video footage from viewers and readers on news channels and websites, and no ability for mainstream news media to experiment with wikis or community-built sites. It would, of course, be far too expensive. Tony first, actually, because, Tony, you've spoken about how you quite like the idea of a sort of explosion of citizen journalism as a kind of democratic force.
Even if they're members of the NUJ, I wouldn't mind if they had a blog, if anyone's doing one. I set your minds at rest.
But do you accept that perhaps then the union has to step away from that kind of thing, that this is actually something that goes beyond...
I've got my tape recorder, and I started it in 1974 because I found when I had a tape recorder, the journalists were bloody careful, and that's why I started it. And if you didn't have a battery or a tape in it, they were more careful. And I've got about 600 million words stored away as a result of that. And that's my protection. But if people tell lies, you have to make up your mind what to do. The only time I ever went to a lawyer, because some ghastly lie, I went to him, he charged me £500, and at the end he said I hadn't a reputation worth that could be defended. said, well, you have no reputation, so after that I never went back again. You have to deal with lies by argument, or ignore them. And they go on all the time. And that's part of life. And I mean, my instinct, somebody tells a lie, it's a free country, say what you like. I don't have to comment on it, I don't have to reply to it, I don't have to take any notice of it, but I will work out how to deal with that sort of lie. So, but at the same time, I think journalists are responsible for what they publish. And if a journalist writes something that is damaging and untrue, it's not unreasonable to ask him or her to account for what they've written. And that is what the Code of Conduct is about, sort of guide. But I mean, the Ten Commandments would be ruled out on the basis that you say the Ten Commandments will surely get some journalists into difficulties. I can imagine one or two of those commandments where that might apply. And therefore you couldn't really apply the Ten Commandments to journalists. I find this whole discussion really fascinating because I do not see a difference in a journalist, a doctor, a lawyer, a housewife, a child at school. I don't see any difference. And I think if you can't debate and have a difference of opinion because of some union rule book or something, then truthfully you're heading for a Stalinist state. And I would not like to see that happen.
So, from Lenin to Stalin, but David, you wallow in the blogosphere, obviously, and sometimes it's a very uncomfortable place, isn't it?
I think.
What do you think? I mean, in a sense that...
I think wallow is a rather inelegant phrase for the incredibly careful way in which I try to deal with it.
It follows on the Bill O'Reilly thing, doesn't it, as well, where he tried to... not so much about terms and conditions, but he also said he wanted the exchange, the discourse online to be more civilised. Do you think it needs to be? Do you think it needs to be more regulated?
It doesn't really matter whether I think it needs to be or not. And it doesn't really matter whether or not the NUJ has a code of conduct or not. Because this is so big and so individual and so varied. It is not like anything we have ever had before. The nearest thing to it is one gigantic, great marketplace in which anybody is allowed to put up a stall for however long they want, and anybody is allowed to visit any stall they like for no matter how long they want, and so on. And there's all kinds of things in it. There is a high end, there's a low end, there's a middle end, and so on. And all of us are finding it an incredible kind of... Well, I mean, actually, I find it mostly a pleasure to negotiate. There are all kinds of difficulties with it. Complete nonsense can be duplicated, and I mean, you find mistakes continuously. There's a mistake about me in Wikipedia, which every time I appear somebody has put in as kind of a description of what I do. It's a fairly small mistake as it happens, but I let it go because it tells me immediately who is picking up this stuff from Wikipedia and where they're getting it from. So it acts as a kind of little track, if you like. It's the only way I can kind of keep some kind of track of where it's going. So in a way, I can understand why the NUJ should want to do this. But this is actually an enormous challenge which is coming up, and on far more than wages and conditions of writing over the next few years. The real issue is whether or not gradually in the blogosphere there comes, if you like, a kind of trusted area, a more trusted area, and then a much more kind of less formal area. And I think probably that is what will develop, and people will begin to find ways of going to the thing that they most want, whilst ignoring the other things that they want. And it is exactly what Tony has wanted. It is a kind of, and everybody's there. Nazis are there. People who don't know Nazis are Nazis go to sites. You talk about the kind of the Norman Finkelstein thing, which is quite interesting. You get the most extraordinary combinations of political opinions and so on, and none coming together because of the internet. Some of it's worrying, some of it's refreshing, some of it's extraordinary, etc. But there's absolutely no kind of stopping it. The only way you can stop it is by doing what Tony says, which is making your bit of it the best it can be, and then hoping that influences people.
I mean, the code actually, Jeremy, doesn't... I don't think it refers to Nazis at all, does it, in that sense? In the sense you're not seeking to legislate on what people say, but the effect... I mean, Emily Bell's point is that, in effect, if this was actually adopted, and it is very rigorous, it would in effect have a limiting effect on that kind of free-for-all.
It doesn't surprise me that Emily Bell described it as nonsense, because what she and those currently at The Guardian in the management moving towards new media want is journalism on the cheap, and therefore if you try and put an argument to say that you need to retain more professional journalists, that you need high quality pictures, that you need to develop quality content, because I think in the end that's what will win through. Everybody can have a go, but in the end you return to those brands and those places you trust the journalism of. If you want something like that, then you actually have to invest a lot of money in new media. The Guardian, for example, at the moment want to move to 24/7 working. They want to move across the paper and the website, but they want to do it without any more journalists. So they want to spread the same number of people over a much wider area and compete in a global market. Well, the only way you can do that really is to reduce the quality of what you do, because you give every journalist less time to do the kind of stories that they should be doing. So, I mean, there's two things. There's the citizen journalism part of it, which actually there are some really good examples of citizen journalism. It's not about stopping citizen journalism, but it is about stopping companies replacing good journalism with cheap journalism, which is rubbish. The picture taken on the mobile phone, which is not of news value but is free, is not a good use of citizen journalism. The one taken on the 7/7 tube train is an excellent piece of citizen journalism and something that every news organisation should rightly want to use and get hold of. So there is good and bad citizen journalism. What we are trying to do.
I can see that. There's good and bad journalism anyway, and I think if you applied your code of practice to existing journalists, most of them would struggle, actually. Where you talk about lots of sources and, accuracy and...
But surely these are things. Surely these are things. If we are a union that believes in ethical journalism, we should be saying. The fact that companies ignore it, of course, I accept. Rupert Murdoch is not going to turn around and say, "Oh, by the way, the NUJ have come up with a code. We should adopt it." But we should be trying to achieve the highest possible standards of journalism.
How do you define the bit? And this isn't just a sort of academic query. It's how on earth do you define or delineate what is journalism when? I mean, I can see when it's printed, The Guardian, but when The Guardian's online, and when you've got the internet and you've got people contributing and the lines are blurred, how on earth are you supposed to regulate that flow of information continue? When is
we're not trying to regulate that flow of information. In fact, we want to encourage it. But if you have that kind of flow of information, you need good designers, good sub-editors, you need journalists who are writing stuff alongside it, you need background material that backs it up, and so on and so forth. It doesn't stop other people participating in that and democratising it. The problem you've got is when they are being used to replace the good journalists, the good designers, the good photographers, and so on, because it is simply cheap. And at the moment we've established a multimedia commission which is looking precisely at the good and bad practice, because there are some great examples of the use of technology in different places in order to enhance journalism. There are some fantastic examples of really, really bad journalism. I'll give you one. Everyone should go to the Reading Evening Post's website, part of Guardian Media, and they should watch the sports. Basically, someone opens a cupboard door, they come in and they pull a curtain behind them, and they sit down and they get a bit of paper and they go, "Here is the sports." And then they proceed to read it, and that is video journalism, vidcasting done on the cheap. It's the guy who writes it for the paper at the end of his shift, after he's done his entire shift, then has to go and sit in the cupboard and read it to a camera that no one is operating. Now, to me, how is that better for journalism?
I actually think I rather like those.
Well, it could become cult, couldn't it?
Well, that's where I found it, on YouTube, I think.
That's right. Does anybody else want to chip in on new media? Obviously, you've got a new media brief. Yeah. The question, I'd like to ask you the same sort of question, really, which is how on earth you differentiate? Because, funnily enough, quite seriously, the cheap, the point of the internet is that it's cheap, cheerful, accessible, and that there aren't barriers to people to doing journalism on it. So, if you impose this, then there will be.
I think the most important thing to that is actually the very top of it, because who's the code of conduct for?
Witness contributors.
No, it's not.
Well, no, so it's organisation, sorry, but it's about...
It is actually a code of conduct we drew up for the likes of The Guardian, the BBC, for the newspapers. It is not for witness contributors. The reason we came up with the term witness contributors is that is a specific subgenre of citizen journalists who are those who witness something, who record it and submit it to the media. And the issue we had, and you know, it blew up. Everyone in the media was looking at it after 7/7. You know, these pictures turned up on the news that were captured on a phone. They were fantastic. And every single newscast we were seeing, every single newspaper we were seeing was starting to institute, send us your pictures at the end of their broadcasts. Now, if you ask the people who were working in the BBC at the time what happened, and I've heard the people in the BBC talking about what happened, they get lots of pictures of cats. People sent in hundreds and hundreds of pictures of their cats. The BBC have moved back from this. You don't get at the end of BBC newscast, please send us your pictures anymore. Because it was actually a serious bit of running by people who thought...
But why do you need a code of practice to regulate cat pictures?
Well, we don't. In fact, I think this proves that we really probably didn't need the code of conduct, because reality came out. But what we did want to regulate, and it wasn't the BBC we were most concerned about, it wasn't the Guardian we were most concerned about, because the big players were going to realise this. What was happening was local newspapers were using the pictures of the cats instead of employing their photographers. And they were actually using it because we're seeing across the board in local newspapers that they will use any kind of tat. They'll get rid of journalists, get rid of titles, they'll print Welsh newspapers in Bristol and send them overnight so they arrive the next day. We know this is happening in local media. Newspapers are dying across the board. And this is what the Journalism Matters campaign is about. We did feel we had to put a line in the sand and say there are certain standards we expect of broadcasters of newspapers, and it's not about the posts and the blogs. It's not about those. There's no difference between posts on newspaper blogs and letters.
Sorry, can I ask you a question? The standards you're talking about, I can see why you might want to regulate standards of payment and contribution. I don't quite see why it's your job to tell newspapers what standards of journalism they should employ. I mean, frankly, that particular horse bolted 1,000 years ago, didn't it? I mean, or am I getting something mixed up here? I mean,
who are we? We're the journalists. We are the people who work for these newspapers. Why shouldn't we tell our own employers what standards we expect of them? And that's what I do every day. That's what I've always done. Why the hell wouldn't we? We're the ones doing it. We're the ones who expect standards of our employers, and we're the ones telling them what standards we expect. No, I don't want to work for somebody who has bad standards.
Well,
in any way, shape, or form.
Then don't.
Well, I don't.
and that's what your colleagues will look at it.
It's not as easy now, but I currently work for Amnesty International. But I do expect quality from any employer I have, and I will go into their office.
Is there anybody here that's actually felt that their journalistic standards have declined because of witness contributors or citizen journalism in general? I mean, yeah. Sorry, gentleman there.
Yeah, I'd just like to come back on David Aaronovitch, because I think it's a complete cop-out to say that journalists shouldn't try to make a contribution to the standards of the outfits that they're working on. I think it's a complete cop-out to say that you shouldn't try to influence the sort of standards of journalism on the publications or the broadcasting units that you're working on. It's the role of trade unionists and the NUJ to do precisely that, and it's something that we've been doing for several decades now. Now, I work in the magazine industry, and it's quite clear that the employers in my industry are trying to use new technology to try and get rid of well-paid journalists who've been on their titles for several years and replace them with young graduates. And this is already happening. On the back of bringing in new technology, multi-platforming, all the rest of it, they're using it as an excuse to get rid of well-paid, experienced journalists and replace them with young graduates straight out of university who know how to use the technology. And we have to make a stand on that. As a union, we have part of our whole reason of existence is to make sure that is not done. Yeah. And so that's precisely the reason why we're also, the union is now working on another set of guidelines, you'll be pleased to know, which actually puts in place how we should be demanding our employers to actually make sure that the migration over to multi-platforming and all the rest of it is done through negotiations, through proper training, that all any job descriptions that are up for grabs are properly negotiated and so on and so forth. And this is where we're at the moment. But suggest that we should just walk away from it.
Actually, I haven't had a chance to suggest anything yet. If I might just sort of... there's a confusion, it seems to me, in what you've just said. The confusion is between the attempt to, as any trade union might, to make sure that their members are not adversely affected by any change in working practice and so on. So you don't want experienced people slung out for people that are much cheaper. That's one issue. It's quite another to say that the union has a view about the standard of pictures that a newspaper should use. And hold on, or indeed has a very big view about the standard of journalism. You have members working for the Daily Sport. That, to me, has no quality of journalism in it whatsoever. Now, I mean, what is the union's view? Should it be closed down? Should it be taken over by more high-minded proprietors? Should it be nationalised with the top 50 monopolies? I mean, what?
Well, there are two. Can I just try and identify? There are two issues here. One is the professional standards the journalists expect their proprietors to respond to. And that is a professional matter, and if you think that they're sacking somebody who's qualified to bring somebody who's no good, it's time to raise it. Second question you haven't touched on is if some newspaper prints a lie, why doesn't the union take that up instead of letting it go to the Press Complaints Commission? Because if the Daily Mail told a lie about me, I'd rather go to the NUJ in the Daily Mail and say, how did you lie? And that is a question of moral responsibility collectively for what may be said. Now, the other thing about photographers, I tell you this, I went up in 1970 wearing a parachute as Minister of Technology in the 4th supersonic test flight of Concorde. It was a bloody silly thing to do. And I had the first video camera I'd ever seen, and I took it. The BBC wouldn't show it. The quality wasn't good enough. And if I'd landed on the moon, the BBC would not have shown the first because in those days, the BBC engineers actually hated the programmes. They wanted a perfect test card 24 hours a day. So you've got to be careful about photographs.
Can I just... There's a gentleman on by the wall who's been trying to ask a question.
Oh, no.
I mean, some would say some of the picture quality in the BBC News these days is pretty crap as well.
Surely the people who should judge the journalistic standards are the readers. And if the journalistic standards aren't good enough, the circulation will fall. If it doesn't fall, does it matter?
Good question.
It is falling, in fact.
Well, that's Big Brother for you, isn't it?
Tim, do you want to
Yes.
give it to Tim at the back there?
Thanks, my name's Tim Gobson. I'm actually the co-author of the book Journalist, which is on sale at the back. I was going to say thanks to Charlie for the reference to the fact there are signed copies available. There are actually also some very rare on-site. The point has just been made, hasn't it? It's that the NUJ doesn't care about the quality of pictures. The NUJ cares about the commercial success of the publications that its members work for, because their jobs depend on it. So if newspapers are going to cut their staffing to the level that they haven't got any news in, and if they're going to attack a website where their pictures are so awful that they're even worse than YouTube, then people are going to stop looking at them, and the press and people's jobs are in jeopardy. And it's absolutely right that the union should have these concerns, and it has concerns for professional standards as well. Now, David Aaronovitch might say that the union people who work for the Daily Sport, and as a matter of fact it does, and if we've got just a minute, there's a story from history about an occasion when the union defended a member who was sacked by the Daily Sport for inventing a completely fictitious story about a woman who had sex with strangers on aeroplanes under instruction from his features editor, because that was his job. You could actually say it was equally contentious what David Aaronovitch writes for Rupert Murdoch, for instance, supporting the Iraq War, which is against the opinion of the majority of people in this country. It's equally contentious. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, because the NUJ doesn't make that kind of judgment. But if journalists, professional journalists are working for a publication, then the union doesn't say whether what they do is politically right or politically wrong, whether it's the Daily Sport or it's the Times, simply that the paper be produced as professionally as possible and the journalists stick as much as possible in their jobs to the professional standard that the union set. So these things do come together. They also relate to the question of democracy. union is it is a democratic organisation which is more democratic than the society that it's in. We have in Britain a big democratic crisis. National, local government, political parties and so on, democracy a little bit centralised, and democracy at a low ebb. In the NUJ, democracy is at a low ebb. I think we should be honest about this, and that something like the boycott of Israel, or the call for a boycott of Israel, has happened because there is not enough participation in the union. I happen to know that at the BBC, where 350 people signed Rory's petition, there was a meeting a week before the annual conference where members were asked to come along and instruct the delegates to the conference how to vote on all the motions, including the one on Israel, and not a single person turned up. Now, nobody blames them for that. It happened because the level of participation, the democratic participation is too low. But it is absolutely vital to keep those democratic structures because they don't exist anywhere else in society.
Can I just make a point about quality? Because, I mean, we got kind of slightly sidetracked on the quality of a picture, but actually the point Tim's making about there are two issues that the union should be interested in: the democratic deficit, and one of the things we did with the Journalism Matters campaign we've been running is have a look at how many local papers now send people to cover council meetings. Well, they don't, because they don't have enough staff to do it, so they ring the council press office the following day and ask what went on at the council meeting. Fantastic if you're the party in power, not quite so good if you're the opposition party, because obviously you get the council PR. There's a huge local democracy issue about the cuts that there have been in local newspapers. The other, which was part of the BBC dispute last year, it wasn't just save jobs. The slogan was save jobs, defend quality, was the two things we put. And it doesn't matter what kind of journalism you do, if you don't have the resources to do it, the quality suffers. If the quality suffers, in the case of a newspaper, you lose readers and the commercial success of that.
The point here is that The Guardian isn't going to survive if it doesn't adopt all those efficiencies, if it doesn't adopt all those new audiences, if it doesn't find other streams of income. And that they literally couldn't do it if they enforced this. So isn't this just going to be self-defeating?
Isn't that a debate we would be having with the Guardian management? And we do, and in fact we are in the midst of negotiations with them over the move towards greater convergence of media platforms. And of course we have to recognise there are changes. We have to recognise global declines in newspaper sales, structural changes in the industry. But what we don't have to do is say, oh well, that means that we'll sell out the quality or the ethics or the standards or anything else. So part of our job is to defend those principles, defend the jobs, defend the pay rates, improve those things as well, alongside recognising that there is technological change that we cannot hold back. Therefore, how best do we adapt to it? The problem is not the technology, it is the employers who try to use the technology on the cheap. That's the issue.
Yeah, but this raises the wider question, you see, of whether economic arguments are going to settle the matter. I could run a much cheaper post office if I only had to deliver in London. Why, you know, if you have to deliver up in Orkney and Shetland and provide material for the blind, which the post office does, of course, you have to charge higher prices. I mean, for example, I'm sure I could run a cheaper police force than the Home Office, provided I could recruit anyone I met in the street to volunteer. I think you could dispense with elections if candidates put in a bid, and on polling day the returning officer opened the bids and announced who'd won. One or two people think that people could do the Prime Minister's job better to lower salary.
I don't have a choice about my policemen.
Pardon?
I don't have a choice about policemen, but I do have a choice about my media, don't I?
Well, the question then you have to ask yourself is, are the media just part of that basis? I mean, I've heard it said it would be cheaper to outsource pensioners to India, where the weather's better and the care is cheaper. And I don't particularly want to go to India on those grounds. And I think this whole, you see, they talk about, you take another example, they say the post office are losing money, the police are losing money, the schools are losing money, the hospital. Is the post office a service or not? Is there an element of service in a free press, which is what I imagine the NUJ believes and I believe, that you have to take a broader view of it all. Yeah. So I think you've got to be very careful.
But they're certainly not losing any money. The press. The press.
Of course they're not. Murdoch could buy the Guardian tomorrow if he has a chance.
isn't it?
Yeah, my name's Peter Nolan. I'm kind of a journalist, I'm kind of not. Just the point I'd like to make, and maybe I might start making a statement rather than a question, is I think what you're all missing is that there's people other than the card-carrying members of the NUJ or people who work professionally as journalists and points to make, and that's kind of what's missing here. You know, it's kind of appropriate that I feel the way that Benn is here, because you know there used to be a British car industry, there used to be a British coal mining industry, and you know it's one thing that was one major contributor to the destruction of both was unreasonable union militancy. The car industry, you know, is replaced now by Japanese transplants. The coal industry is replaced by North Sea gas and imported gas, you know, to the benefit of the environment and the consumer. So, you know, can you not think, you know, that the conversation has to be a lot wider than, you know, what self-described journalists or what self-described members of the NUJ or the employees of the BBC.
Well, Thatcher sacked the miners on the grounds that the pits were uneconomic. We've got 300 years of coal around our territory, and we're fighting wars about energy, and we haven't any miners to dig. I mean, it's a good difference between the short-term and the long-term view. Yeah. I mean, this idea of the militancy of the miners goes a bit load of rubbish. But that was the argument the press put out, and you probably read the press, and therefore would be accepted.
But sir, also, you can't, do you dispute that natural gas has been cheaper since 1984? Or do you dispute that Britain has had cheap and readily available supplies of natural gas, which it doesn't have to...
On natural gas, let's go back to new media. Let's go back to new media. Is anybody else who thinks that, because it's quite interesting how, even if you think that there is a quality problem, does anybody here think that things like trade unions, codes of practices, can have any impact upon this? You know, or shouldn't they actually be? Couldn't you argue really that trade unions ought to be actually working to encourage people to take part in journalism, rather than, which this does in effect, kind of put obstacles?
Yeah, but it's about encouraging them to participate on a certain basis, isn't it? What you don't want to encourage racists to write racist comments on the internet, do you? So, I mean, the participation of people is a good thing. What we are trying to do is say that we think that we should try to encourage that high standards where there is that participation. I mean, the union provides around 3,000 people every year. We provide training to help them design websites, all those kind of things. Not all of those are card-carrying members of the NUJ. Some of them are people who want to set up their own websites and things like that. We think that is a good role that we can help to play in order to professionalise some of the work that they are doing and improve the standards in it. So.
Sorry. Woman at the back, please. Sorry, don't know your name.
Of course, codes of conduct do have an impact. They don't change the world overnight. But first of all, they promote debate. And debate makes people realize that there are ethical standards that we have to maintain. And there is impact of unethical practices which have an effect on other people's lives, sometimes destroy their lives. Many years ago, I remember when I started journalism, the language, the racist language and the racist headline we used to see in newspapers like The Sun and the Daily Express, etc., where the words "bog" and the use of word black mugger, etc., have now disappeared. It is because of the code of conduct.
No, it isn't.
Because of that kind of debate.
It isn't because of the code of conduct, unfortunately. It's because of something much better, which is that people simply wouldn't accept it. It wasn't, I mean, you could argue that the discussion about the code of conduct was a very specific and minor form of that debate, but the real reason why it didn't happen was because readers increasingly and viewers and so on wouldn't tolerate it. They wouldn't tolerate it for a whole host of reasons to do with what had been discussed nationally, but I should think the code of conduct was almost the least of those.
Well, I think you know really to say that anyone who says what the code of conduct said was unimportant because opinion changed. It was a part of the mood that led to the change. I think it's a great mistake to dismiss.
And actually it encourages a debate amongst journalists who are the very people who then are writing the papers and things like that. Well, it does. Let me give you one concrete example of it then. The Daily Express, with 9 days in a row, headlines on asylum seekers. The person who was asked to write those articles had other people putting headlines on that they were very unhappy with because they believed them to be unethical. They came to the union organised a discussion amongst the Express journalists. The Express journalists said they would go on strike if any one of their members was forced to write these articles. The sad fact is the Express has too many people who aren't union members, so they continue to write them. They just get your non-union members to do it rather than union members. That provoked a debate amongst 150 journalists about the right way to handle important issues about asylum and immigration in the country. It's not about censorship, it is about how do we handle them in a balanced way and not in the way in which they were being handled there.
Were you hinting just now that you think that the internet ought to be controlled? And if so, who should control it and what should their remit be?
No, should not be controlled. I don't believe in the control from the top at all. I think in a free debate, the arguments come out and people make up their own mind about it. I mean, Milton campaigned against the licensing of the press. In 1401, the House of Commons passed an act making it an offence of heresy for lay people to read the Bible. And if they read the Bible and they weren't priests, they were burned at the stake. Hansard was imprisoned for publishing the reports of the House of Commons. There's always an attempt to control. I am a libertarian, and funnily enough, as a libertarian, I find myself meeting people from the right round the back. Lord Mackay, you know, Mrs. Thatcher's Lord Chancellor, was boiling with rage at the treatment of Brian Hoare. And so I think libertarian is distinct from, you know, your own particular political opinion. So it's an interesting argument, but I am for absolute freedom to publish.
Are you a libertarian in the sense that you think, in principle, you know, free speech, as Tony is describing, or are you a libertarian in recognition of the fact that the internet is going to be very, very difficult to control because it's very difficult to go to a newsroom and exercise that kind of pressure?
And I hope that on the whole I'm a libertarian out of conviction. I mean, I do think, again, going back a ways, it struck me, and I think, again, Tony's right about this, there are people who fundamentally believe that you can control the way in which people think by making other people shut up. Even if you did believe that, and I don't, it simply is unsustainable now. Even those people who believe, like Canute's courtiers, you could hold back the waves, are overwhelmed by the waves coming in. And it's simply a kind of physical fact that they have to deal with. And that means that the approach of saying that you have to argue for everything and you have to create quality yourself is what's going to clinch it. I hope that Jeremy is right, that people will go towards what they trust. But I have to say that on the internet, trust is not what everybody is looking for. Some people are looking for sensation. Some people are looking for argument. Some people are looking for the most rebarbative possible confirmation of their own pre-existing views, which is also kind of major. Which I think
most of them are then sending them to me by email.
But I want to say something which I kind of feel, because I've got to say this to Tim Goxall. Tim, if you don't understand the difference between me giving my personal opinion about a major international affair in the Times and saying this is my personal opinion, and somebody writing a deliberate lie in a newspaper, you think they're the same thing, I wonder if the NUJ is the right place for you to be an official. I can't help wondering if you really do think that. I think there is a distinction to be made. I don't think we should be in the lying business, and I think that part of the problem with modern journalism is that we are increasingly in a tawdry and lying business, and we are afraid to say so. I'll give you an example of a standard slip which I did just yesterday in Stamford to give a speech. Went to a hotel, 6 o'clock. I want to find out what's happening in Gaza. It isn't amongst the top 4 headlines on the BBC 6 o'clock news. It's absolutely extraordinary. It's by far the biggest thing happening in the world. We have Michael Barrymore as number 1. We have Beast Children as number 2. The princes talk about Princess Diana as number 3. That's an example of quality slip. I can take you to serious newspapers whose headlines are lies. They are not actually based on the story, which then happens lower down inside the story. These are all kind of quality questions. Now, I don't know whether we can kind of hold, whether it's left or right. It seems to me that there is a place somewhere for saying, whatever your opinion is, this is the nearest we can get to telling you what is going on. And here are a range of views by people who tell you this is their prejudices and so on, which you can then choose from within the course of the debate. I mean, I hope to kind of get there. I don't know how it's going to be done. I suspect on the whole that the NUJ is on the side of is on the side of good in this sort of thing, which is why I'm not inclined to take a simple anti-union line and say that you shouldn't have an NUJ. I have to say that the thing that operates against it is what our friend here from the Today programme. I don't know if you're still on the Today programme, but I'm sure you did, because the very notion that you couldn't actually be a journalist of record about the Middle East without understanding the need for a boycott of Israel, I think was absurd.
Isn't the point that Rupert Murdoch allows
I'm afraid it is what he said.
Rupert Murdoch allows you that call because of what you said. He's not. I mean, there was a recent thing I think on the Amy Goodman show, which is on the internet, about how that darling of the left, Noam Chomsky, issues editorials, and the New York Times never prints them, so now they come out in book form. There's a reason why newspapers are owned by incredibly rich people, as we know. It'd be very difficult to start a new newspaper now, I think, and the Independent is backed by people who are suffering.
You start a website.
Don't make out that it's this amazing free market of ideas you can take it or leave it.
But isn't it?
Isn't it now? This Hayekian...
Hold on, can I just say, because the point goes here, I mean, there is a point in what you're saying, but it isn't the point that you think it is. For instance, one of the things that Jeremy said back in 2003 was that Rupert Murdoch Press was slamming and savaging anybody who was against the war. We employ several columnists who have been savagely promoted because of their opposition towards the war. It just doesn't work in quite the way that you seem to suggest.
Yeah, but they're coming from a different position.
Oh, I see. They're against the war, but they're from the wrong position.
But did any one of his 175 newspapers take a line against the war in their editorial?
No, that's not what you said. That's not what you said, Sean. If I could quote you back what you said. You said the Murdoch Press was using its 175 newspapers to savagely slam anybody who was against the war. How could that be the truth when a large number of the employees of that paper were writing leading columns opposing the war?
And yet every one of the editorials slammed the critics of the war.
No, it didn't say editorials, actually. Well, you said Rupert Murdoch's 175 papers all followed suit, adopting a pro-war stance and viciously attacking those who spoke out against the war.
Yep.
We had people speaking out against the war in the Times. Some of them, like Matthew Paris, are the most famous journalists in Britain.
Yeah, but I tell you the problem that you have to consider. I find on the net every morning, I get something called the Information Clearinghouse. I don't know why it's sent to me. And I get more information on the Information Clearinghouse than I get from the newspapers. Yeah. And when I read The Guardian, as you do, but if I didn't read The Guardian, I'd miss Max Hastings and Polly Toynbee and Jackie Ashley, and who else, George Monbiot. But as far as the news is concerned, I get far more news that way. Now, that is a problem that journalists have to think about.
But what we're coming
I don't know what the answer to it is, but you don't actually, if you follow the news very, very carefully in detail, you don't necessarily have to read any newspapers, and I don't know how you cope with that.
Yeah, which is sort of the point. Tim, do you want to come very quickly to you?
Sorry if I was
briefly
misunderstood. The point I was trying to make, the NUJ understands why people who write for publications write what they do, and it doesn't make judgments about them, that's all.
Anybody else want to come in on the new media? Anybody else feel deeply threatened by the quality? Sorry.
I'd just like to very quickly make the point that this kind of conduct is an irrelevancy. Our members in AOL are at the point. The future of the NUJ is in the media as it exists, and we have representation in AOL. We broke the back of Time Warner, one of the most anti-union companies in the world, to get recognition. We have a very, very strong chapel there at the moment. We are moving out. We have a whole new media sector. There's a whole part of the union set up to work in new media. This is not about that. This is about the big newspapers and the big broadcasters and the small newspapers and the small broadcasters and what they do in new media. It's not about new media. It's not about indie media, who we stood up very strongly for when they had their servers seized. It's not about that sphere. That sphere is out there, and that's what I do, and that's where I work. And I had a part in putting this together, but that's for the centre of the union. I'm an NUJ member. I've been an NUJ member for years, since I was a student. I don't work in the mainstream media. I work on a website and I put it together. And the NUJ is as much as important for me, and the standards of the NUJ are as important for me as they have been for 100 years. But that's the future of the NUJ, and it is in new media as well as it's in old media, and they're all old now, until they come up with another one, and that'll be new media. But that's where we are, and that's where we're going, and we will continue to be where we have been, and we will continue to move out into the new frontiers as they develop and as they come. And we will be going there with standards and with principles, and that's what we're for.
And one of those standards, just very quickly on the AOL question, because I represented people there who were recruited to be independent financial journalists, to write the financial services that were on the AOL news service. A decision was taken that in order to generate more revenue, that financial information should be geared towards selling more products of those who advertised on the AOL sites. Now, we represented people, they weren't prepared to accept that change in their contract, we got them a deal, they left. But that is a sign of the way in which that journalism in some websites and in amongst some media is changing, that they are using the internet to sell the products of the people who advertise, rather than having the advertising very distinct from the editorial.
Okay. Well, we're... Sorry, go on.
Makes me feel like I should do a song. Can I ask the panel's opinion on where they think the kind of convergence with new media is going in respect of big corporations and newspaper barons wanting to be the kind of sort of sharks amongst the minnows, buying up various websites that they see as popular, so YouTube, MySpace or whatever. I'd like to know the kind of panel's opinion on that, whether they think it's always going to, whether the internet is going to stay the kind of new frontier that it is at the moment, or whether it will be picked up by major people and what that impact will be.
It's Rupert, isn't it?
Honestly, I'm not a great kind of business strategy person, so I don't know. I mean, I can only take this at the kind of level of observation. Absolutely nobody knew when the internet began the form that it, nobody predicted, absolutely nobody. But it reminds me of that, the computer in 2001, you remember, which was a film made in 1968, and the one that says, "I can't do that, Dave." You remember that computer? It's the size of a wall. It's absolutely huge. By 2001, the computer you actually would have had something like that. It would just be the size of Charlie's head. That small. And
well recovered.
Yeah. Because we just couldn't see the way in which the technology was going to be, and likewise with the internet. And there's a lot of people who think they can see it. The one thing that I tend to think about this is, as fast as they buy these things up, somebody will create a new one which is more popular, because that's the way in which it's going. These things have a kind of cultural utility. Some of them become like, newspaper headlines or newspaper stories, like say the McCann story, vastly overused. One of the things you see in newspaper internet hits is that the McCanns has actually been the story that they've all tried to get, people have tried to get into, and then anything with the word testicle in it comes very kind of close. So you can actually look at your hits, but the hits of the future, they're very, very difficult. They're very difficult to predict. I met somebody today who had just been to see a company called Joost, Joost. Joost are going to be able, by the looks of it, to bring television on demand to people's computers, using a form of targeted advertising specifically made for the person profile who's using that particular computer. Now, if it's a success, gradually one of the big media conglomerates will take it over. But the fact is, they didn't invent it, and the next thing will come up that they didn't invent as well. I'm pretty sure. So it's a continuous game of catch-up, because this really is. I mean, one of my colleagues, Simon Jenkins, makes a kind of profession of saying nothing's new. This really is different. What's going on in terms of people's ability to use it is genuinely different. my big hope for it is that somehow or other, and this is something that the NUJ has done, the NUJ took a stand on Yahoo's censoring itself into China. I thought that was a very, very important thing to do, and hope it will extend it to other countries like Iran, which are also intent upon censoring what its people can and cannot see, and so on. I thought it's a very, very important thing to do. Once we overcome that, the potentiality is absolutely enormous, but it's a potentiality for all kinds of things. We don't actually know absolutely what it's a potential for. If you're an optimist, like Tony is, then you believe that people's use of it will benefit, will generally be benefit. There are, of course, pessimists who believe that people's nature unleashed will actually mean that it will be dreadful.
Jeremy, in a sense,
yeah, I mean,
this solves the ownership conundrum for you, doesn't it? Doesn't it?
Well, it doesn't, because precisely what David's saying is that whenever there is anything that is successful, the big companies are coming in and buying it up, and there is a certain sense of panic in the industry at the moment of people trying to find something that will make them more money as their revenue from traditional media, be it TV advertising or newspaper advertising, goes down. They're trying to replace that with revenue from internet advertising, and quite successfully in some cases. The last year Trinity Mirror saw a 100% increase in its internet revenue. Last week one of the other newspaper companies announced a 66% increase in that. So they are out there trying to buy up what is successful. As to where it goes, I mean, I really don't know. I sat at a TUC meeting, and I might be the middle-aged guy in the suit who's the trade union general secretary, but actually for trade union general secretaries I'm probably 20 years younger and a few stone lighter than most of the others, and I sat in a room with them at the TUC this week whilst we discussed Second Life and how we could all have these virtual lives, and we could have the same virtual debate we're having here, but we wouldn't actually have to be there, and we could wear virtual t-shirts with union logos on, drinking virtual coffee. And I sat there thinking, or I could go down to AOL and recruit some of them into the union, but people are making huge success out of it. People are making a lot of money out of these things, and to some extent, when the NUJ moved offices 5 years ago, we cleared out our old library and packed up the books, and there was a book there about the last development of new technology, or real development of new technology in the late 70s, late 80s, around the introduction of desktop publishing and everything else like that. And we pretty much did a pamphlet at the time that says, "Don't worry, computers, they'll never catch on." So I'd hate to be the one who's at the forefront of telling you where it's going. I think the point about wherever it's going, that there are going to have to be people working in jobs, producing it, working with it, whatever. And the point of the role of a trade union, whatever the technology, whatever the company, is about making sure that people there have a certain job security, that they're treated well, that they have decent terms and conditions. And that's why we are kind of embracing this new technology and the jobs that are in it, but also trying to make sure that some, if you like, traditional standards about labour standards are there as well.
Tony, you remember the white heat of technology. I mean, does this feel
different to you? I was in Kiev years and years ago. The Soviet Union was there, and I met a man called Akademician Grushkov. He was a young man, a cyberneticist, and he said something I've never forgotten. He said there are three things of technical developments have happened since the war. The atom bomb, which frightened people, the space missions, which excited people, but the most important of all, he said, is the computer revolution, which nobody noticed. He then had a room full of computers with tapes buzzing, and he said to me, "Do you want to know what day of the week you were born?" Well, actually, I knew, so I said, yes, I would. I gave him my birth, 3rd of April, 1925, and these things whizzed and swung, and after about 10 minutes, they said, it was a Friday. And I said, I know. Said, how did you know? And I said, I remember being so excited on the Thursday, and this was translated. But I tell you what we've got to be careful of, that there's some government control of it. Because when I look back, you see, Henry VIII nationalised the Church of England because the Church was so powerful. You know why the Royal Mail was set up in 1660 by King Charles II? Because he wanted to open everybody's letters. The only way he could do it. The Royal Mail was the birthday of my 5. And then the BBC was nationalised by a Tory government. So the one you mustn't do is to allow the government to control it. But I think it's not unreasonable to say it's got to be split up. And I think the Murdoch empire should be split. I don't think anyone should be able to own a newspaper, several newspapers and a television and so on. And that is a reasonable argument to put forward. And then within it, the unions have to organise. But it is changing so rapidly now, isn't it? I mean, what you can get, I'm a silver surfer, I struggle, and when my laptop crashes, my grandchildren press a couple of buttons and it works. But even I find that what I have access to now is absolutely staggering.
Isn't it?
And I realise one thing, and I leave this thought with you. Every day I get up at 7 in the morning, I go to bed about midnight, and I learn something. But every day 6 billion other people get up at 7 and go to bed. And so every night when I go to bed, I know less of what there is to be known than when I woke up. And when I go to university graduations, I always say to the students, when you leave this university, you will be relatively more ignorant when you take it. So the secret is to think about it. And I met a young lad the other day who went to Oxford on a visit. He's at a technical college. They said, "What class are you?" And he said, "I am a member of the thinking class." I thought that was a bloody good answer.
Listen, that's a really good place to leave it, actually, because it's always good to end on an optimistic note of relative ignorance, which is where I spend most of my life, actually. Thanks very much to Jeremy. Thanks very much, Tony and David. Thanks all of you for coming for such an interesting and diverse discussion. So thanks very much.